Well, good morning. It's great to be here with you guys, and good morning to those who are joining us online. And say hi if you haven't yet. You know, I remember when I was a kid, I watched a movie called Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And right now, some of you are thinking he must be older than he looks. But yes, I did watch that, and when it pretty soon after when it came out, and I remember watching it as a kid, and at the end of the movie, the credits rolled, and then after the credits were over, Ferris Bueller himself, played by Matthew Broderick, he came out and he broke the fourth wall and addressed the viewers one last time. And this was my first experience with a post-credit scene in a movie. And there's a popular trend in movies these days, especially superhero movies, where the movie ends, right? It's still dark, the credits are rolling, and nobody moves, right? Nobody gets up to leave. They sit there through 10 minutes of credits to catch the post-credit scene. And sometimes there's even a mid-credit scene or something like that, and it's just getting kind of out of hand. But what's the purpose of these scenes? Well, in the case of the superhero movies, right, they're these big budget, studio-driven, part of these big franchises. And so they want to show you, hey, come see the next movie. This is how this connects to the other movies that are happening. And maybe even they're tying up some loose ends from the movie. And you actually have to see the post-credit scene to even know what in the world's going on sometimes. And it's just kind of changed the way people behave when they go to the movies. Like, nobody gets up and gets their stuff together anymore. They wait to see if there's something that happens after the credits. And we're going to be in John chapter 21 today, which is the last chapter of the book of John. And John chapter 21 is a post-credit scene to the book of John. Because technically the book of John has ended at the end of John chapter 20 with these verses, where it says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That's how chapter 20 ends, and it sounds like an ending. In fact, it sounds so much like an ending that some scholars have suggested that John 21 was added later by somebody else other than John, who wrote the book of John. The problem with that is all the manuscripts of the book of John that we have include John 21, and it really looks like John wrote it. But he wrote it on purpose, kind of like an addendum, like a post-credit scene almost to the book. Jesus has died on the cross, he's risen from the dead, he's appeared to his disciples as one final sign that he is the Son of God. But there are still some loose ends that John, this writer, has to tie up. He has to explain how these very confused disciples who just not long before were running scared because their teacher had been arrested and crucified, now they're suddenly boldly proclaiming and preaching the risen Jesus. What happened there? Where did that come from? Also, John wants to show how these disciples, they took up Jesus' call to create a Christian community that was focused on love and care. Where did that come from? That community that Daryl was talking about. Well, we're going to see that today. Jesus doesn't just want these disciples to believe that he rose from the dead. He wants them to form a community of believers. And that's why we're looking at this account today, because at Canyon Springs, we're officially launching life groups this week. And we're challenging you to get into Christian community, to encourage, to challenge one another, to live out, to grow in that context of that community. And in this account, we can see the origins of that Christian community. And John's doing one more thing with this. He's in this post-credit scene, so to speak. He's closing the loop on the story of Peter's denial of Christ, which is what we looked at last week. And so let's recap that situation before we jump into this story, because they tie together so closely. The night Jesus was betrayed by Judas, and he was arrested, Jesus had this conversation with Peter in John chapter 13. It says, Simon Peter asked him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus replied, where I'm going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. Peter asked, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Then Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And so Jesus predicts that Peter is going to disown him, not once, not twice, but 3 times. That's going to happen. And pay attention to that word follow when Jesus says, you can't follow where I'm going right now, but you will follow later. We're going to come back to that. That word follow is very important. File that statement away because we're going to come back. But here's what happened right after Jesus was arrested and taken into custody in chapter 18 of John. It says Simon Peter followed Jesus as Jesus is being taken away, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. All right, so we see Peter's first denial here, and we also get an incidental detail that becomes very significant later, and that's the detail of the fire. So as the bondservants and the soldiers and Peter himself, they're all warming themselves around a fire, but specifically it's a charcoal fire. Why am I making a big deal out of this? It's a different word in the Greek. It's a very specific word that refers to a specific type of fire. And so file that away. We're going to come back to that. But look at verse 25. Verse 25. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, so they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. So the location of Peter's second and third denials of Jesus was standing around this fire. And after this, Jesus is crucified, he's buried, and who knows what's going through Peter's mind. I'm sure he was in a very dark place at this point. He's struggling. And then Jesus' tomb is discovered to be empty. And Jesus is risen. The risen Jesus begins to appear to his disciples and speak to his disciples, which brings us to John chapter 21. So let's look at it together, starting in verse 1. It says, "Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. All right, so Peter is a fisherman by trade. It's been a little while since they've seen the risen Jesus. It's been a few days, maybe even a couple weeks. They're excited that Jesus is alive, but they're still kind of confused and not really sure what are they supposed to be doing right now. What should they be doing next? This is why John, the author, tells us that Jesus appears to his disciples here in this situation. In the absence of specific direction from Jesus, Peter goes back to what he knows. He goes back to fishing, because that's what he was doing before Jesus called him as a disciple. He was a fisherman. And so he goes back to fishing. Plus, he's probably thinking, a guy needs to make a living, right? Like, why am I just sitting around? I could go earn some money. I could go catch some fish. And the disciples that are with Peter are James and John, the sons of Zebedee. John is the author of the book of John. And also Nathanael and Thomas, plus 2 other unnamed disciples, so a total of 7, go out fishing. And the interesting thing about Nathanael and Thomas is these are 2 disciples who at one time, both of them doubted that Jesus really was who he said he was, that he really was the Messiah, that he really was the Son of God. Nathanael, back at the beginning of John, I can't remember if it's in John chapter 1 or John chapter 2, but he's like, can anything good come out of Galilee? He doubts that Jesus really is who he said he is. And then in John chapter 20, Thomas also doubts that Jesus has risen from the dead. In both cases, Jesus did something supernatural to prove to them that he actually was who he said he was. So this group goes out to fish, and they fish all night because that's what commercial fishermen in that culture do. They fish at night, then during the day they mend their nets and go to market and all that kind of stuff. And they don't catch anything. Look at what happens next. Verse 4. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. All right, so Jesus shows up. He kind of rubs it in a little bit that they haven't caught anything. Like, "Hey guys, you have any fish?" They're like, "No, thanks for asking," right? And he's like, "Okay, try fishing on the other side of your boat." Because as we all know, fish just like to hang out on one side of the boat usually. And when you're fishing, the secret is just figuring out which side of the boat the fish are biting on, right? And I mean, this instruction is totally arbitrary, right? But they're like, "Okay, whatever, we'll throw it over." And they get this miraculous catch of fish. And the disciple whom Jesus loved recognizes that this is Jesus. And this disciple whom Jesus loved, this is John. This is the author of the book of John. He never refers to himself by name. He always uses other ways to refer to himself, and this is one of those ways. So he's the one who identifies as Jesus. Peter is so excited to see Jesus, he jumps into the water, and he swims the 100 yards back to shore. But he makes sure he gets dressed before he jumps in the water, which might seem a little bit backwards to us, right? He puts his cloak on, then he jumps in. But really what's going on is he's working in his underwear, basically, and so he wants to be decent when he sees Jesus, and so he puts his cloak on and then jumps in the water, which seems a little bit weird. But Jesus is waiting for them with breakfast, already set out. He's got bread, he's got fish, he's got a fire. But it's not just any type of fire. It's a fire of burning coals. It's a charcoal fire. And this conversation we're about to read in a moment takes place around a charcoal fire. Now, remember I said this is a very specific word in the Greek. It describes a very particular type of fire. John could have used any word. There's lots of different words he could have used to talk about fire. But this word is only used twice in the entire New Testament. This specific word, right here in verse 9 and back in John chapter 18 that we already read earlier. And so look at verse 10. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat, dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This is now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. All right, so John gives the exact number of fish, 153 fish. And the scholars have theories about all the significance of this number and what is it. You want to know my theory? Here's what we know for sure. 153 refers to the number of fish that were in the net. That's all we really know for sure, okay? So, I don't know, how many of you like to fish? Any people like to fish in here? Okay, how many of you keep track of how many fish you catch? Yeah, so that's a thing, right? John wants you to know we caught a lot of fish. I'm going to tell you the exact number. That's my theory. But I wonder if the disciples remembered there was that one time when Jesus multiplied the bread and the fish, not only to feed them, but also to feed 5,000 men and their families. The language is even kind of similar as the story in John 6. This is what John 21 says. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. And then in John 6, it says this. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. So Jesus is making the same point all over again. He is the one who supplies what these disciples need. And he is the true bread of life. That's what he claims about himself. So by their own efforts, they're going to come up empty, but with Jesus, they're going to have everything they need. He's making that point. And also, eating together is a sign of community. We've talked about this before. But Jesus has shared his life with these disciples. And now he's sharing a meal with them on the beach. He's eating with them, once again reinforcing his relationship with them. And none of the disciples, not even Thomas or Nathanael, who've been skeptics in the past, none of them question that Jesus is really who he said he is. Right now they have no doubt Jesus is the real deal. The question is, are you convinced? The question is, when it comes to Jesus, where do you stand? This is a question that every person has to wrestle with, and we don't get to stay neutral. By saying, well, I'm not going to really decide about that now. You were making a decision. Because every single one of us has been confronted with the truth about who Jesus is, and we have to decide what we're going to do with that. And the question is, have you made the decision to trust Jesus with your whole life? Have you taken that step? And if not, maybe God is prompting you to take that step today. And if that's the case, you've had multiple people up here on the stage today that would love to talk with you about that. DJ and Zach and Daryl and myself, like any one of us, we would love to have that conversation with you. What does it look like to follow Jesus with your life? And now we come to this conversation between Jesus and Peter, and remember the setting here. They're around a charcoal fire. Look at verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "and you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Now, this is a fascinating conversation that I want to just kind of walk back through, shed some light on the details. But first, Jesus refers to Peter by his real name. He calls him Simon. Peter was really more of a nickname. Simon is his real name. And he says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" What are the these that Jesus is talking about? Well, we don't really know. The Greek isn't very clear here. There could be three options, really. It could be, do you love me more than you love these other disciples? It could be that. But that doesn't seem like a great interpretation, because why would Jesus ask Peter if he loves these disciples more than him? Is that something we've seen Peter struggle with? Not really. So another option that Jesus could be saying is, do you love me more than these other disciples love me? But that also seems like a strange interpretation, because how could Peter know if he loves Jesus more than these other disciples love him? Is Jesus asking Peter to claim that he loves Jesus more than these? I mean, what's that about? Only Jesus knows people's hearts. Only Jesus knows which of these disciples, if at all, if any of them love him more than other ones. So the third option is also the best option in my mind, which is Jesus is saying, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He's referring to Peter's net and boat and fishing tackle. He's saying, "Peter, do you love me more than this? Do you love me more than being a fisherman?" And it's interesting that Jesus calls him Simon, son of John. I think it's significant because we think, well, why is Jesus bringing his father into this? What's that about? Well, in that culture, you learn your trade from your father. Just about everyone took over the family business when their father died. So Peter learned to be a fisherman from his father. So is this the life, Jesus is saying, is this the life you're going to choose? Or will you choose to leave it all behind again and follow me? Now, we don't see it in our English translation, but there are two different words for love being used in this passage. One is agape and the other is phileo. An agape describes a type of love that places deep value on the other. It's always used when describing God's love for us, is agape love. The love we're supposed to have for God is also agape. It's the type of love that we should have for our Lord. And phileo is the close brotherly love that exists between dear friends. And both words describe genuine love. Both are very significant words for love. There's some overlap between the meanings, but it's interesting that both words are used here. Peter only uses the word phileo. When he says love, he's saying phileo. And when Jesus uses the word agape twice, and then he switches to phileo for the third question. So also, when Peter answers, Jesus responds with these challenges to Peter. And they're similar, but they're slightly different. And so let me give you my interpretation of this conversation, kind of according to the original Greek, kind of see, like, add a little bit of, maybe a little bit deeper meaning for it. All right, so here we go. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you deeply value me more than these fishing tools and the life of a fisherman?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that we are dear friends." Jesus said, feed and care for those young in the faith. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you deeply value me? He answered, Yes, Lord, you know that we are dear friends. Jesus said, lead and shepherd the believers under your care. It's at this point that then Jesus switches up the word for love that he's using. The third time, Jesus said to him, Simon, son of John, are we dear friends? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, are we friends? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that we are the dearest of friends. Jesus said, feed and care for your fellow believers. Peter is hurt. He's upset when Jesus asks him the same question the third time because it reminds him of another occasion when he was asked the same question 3 times. The night that he denied being one of Jesus' disciples 3 times. Peter is once again tested, and once again this test takes place around a charcoal fire. Because Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times, now Jesus asks him 3 times to confirm his love for Jesus. This time Peter passes the test. And every time he responds, Jesus responds back with a charge for Peter to take care of and lead his fellow believers. And Peter's going to prove that he loves Jesus by feeding his lambs, by taking care of and feeding his sheep. Jesus makes it clear that we demonstrate our devotion to him by taking care of others. Then Jesus says this. Look at verse 18. It says, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. Jesus tells Peter in these verses that someday he will die because of his faith in Jesus. That he's going to give his life. He will be led to a place of execution, a place he does not want to go. His hands will be stretched out, and he will glorify God. The historical record that we have from the early church says that Peter was crucified on a cross like Jesus was. His hands were stretched out. Many church leaders believe, or they state the tradition is that Peter insisted on being crucified upside down because he didn't believe that he was worthy to be crucified in the same manner as Jesus. And so Jesus tells Peter he's going to die for his faith. Then he says, follow me. This is a call to give his life for Jesus. Now, remember that earlier conversation when Peter said, I want to lay my life down for you, Jesus. I'm going to lay my life down for you. And Jesus says to Peter, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow me later. And so Jesus brings Peter back to that moment when Peter said, I will die for you, Jesus. Now Jesus is saying, okay, now you're ready to follow me. Obviously, this passage, this post-credit scene is just filled with all kinds of meaning and connections to other parts of the book of John. There's so much here. But what does this passage have to do with us? You know, what can we take with us as we step into this new season of life groups? Well, like I said, John wants to show us how Peter and the other disciples took up Jesus' call to create a Christian community that was focused on love and care. So what does that look like? Well, today I want to give you 4 discipleship decisions that we all need to make. 4 decisions that each of us need to make when it comes to following Jesus. And I also have some special instructions for those of us who are taking up that call to lead small groups. So, here are 4 discipleship decisions that we need to make. Here's the first one. Decide that you will love Jesus more than anything else. Jesus asked Peter, do you love me more than these? So the question is, what would Jesus ask you about? If he said your name and he said, do you love me more than blank? What would go in that blank? What gets in the way of your commitment to Jesus more than anything else? We all have to wrestle with that question because Jesus is not going to share the top spot in your life with anything else. Here's the second discipleship decision. And that's to decide to love Jesus as both Lord and friend. Jesus asked Peter if he loved and valued him as his Lord. Do you love me? Do you value me? He also asked Peter to affirm their friendship, agape and phileo. And so following Jesus means we worship him, but it also means we cultivate that personal friendship. We need both as disciples of Jesus. Here's the third decision. Decide to follow Jesus even to death. Jesus made it clear that Peter's going to, if you're going to follow me, Peter, that means you're going to die. You're going to die the same type of death. Following Jesus means you're going to die the same type of death that Jesus died. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to be physically crucified like Jesus was, but following Jesus means we take up our cross daily. We die to ourselves. So Jesus compares this complete humbling of ourselves to dying. Consider this. Many of us would say, I would die for Jesus. I would die for my faith. But listen, physically dying for Jesus once is easier than spiritually dying to yourself for the sake of Jesus every single day. This is what Jesus is calling us to do. Here's the fourth decision. Decide to do the work of a shepherd. I said this earlier. When Peter confirms his love for Jesus, Jesus responds with a charge to Peter. Hey, take care of, lead the fellow believers. Jesus makes it clear that we demonstrate our devotion to him by taking the action of caring for others. Peter is going to prove that he values Jesus by feeding his lambs, by taking care of and feeding his sheep. We aren't just called to be disciples of Jesus, we are called to be disciple makers. This is what Jesus is getting at with his shepherding analogy. As Jesus responds to Peter, he gives us a great job description for small group leaders, for life group leaders. So those of us who are going to be taking up the call to lead a life group should listen well to this. Jesus says 3 phrases. He says, feed my lambs. He says, take care of my sheep. And he says, feed my sheep. Lambs are those who are young in the faith. They haven't been believers for very long. They're still growing in maturity. Sheep are those who should be more mature. They're more grown up in the faith. Both groups need attention. Here's a very brief and yet powerful job description for life group leaders from Jesus' charge to Peter. He says, shepherd, right? Lead, shepherd. Give guidance and leadership. This is pretty straightforward. We're not driven by ego or power. A good shepherd serves and lays down their life for the sheep. He also says, feed. Take them to Scripture. Encourage them to take next steps. You know, one thing I like to encourage group leaders with is this. Get to know, because it's kind of intimidating being a group leader. Get to know each person in your group and encourage them to take one next step in each season of that group. And next steps are often specific to each person. So that's why you have to get to know people. So some examples. Can I encourage you to take the next step of forgiving your sister? Can I encourage you to try praying out loud this week? Or something like maybe, hey, here's a Bible reading plan. Let's commit to read this together and talk about it. So things like that. So that's the second one. Here's the third one. Give particular attention to those who are young in the faith. And what I mean by particular attention is we don't deal with immature believers the same way we deal with mature believers. Just like a shepherd would care for lambs differently than full-grown sheep. There's a lot in this for life group leaders to reflect on, to consider. And I'm going to just kind of leave this, let you consider and reflect if you're in that role. What does it look like for you to be in that role and to follow Jesus in that role? May we be the shepherds that Jesus would have us be. You know, in this post-credit scene to his book, John wants to show us how Peter and the other disciples took up Jesus' call to create this Christian community that was defined by love and by care. And we catch a glimpse in this conversation between Peter and Jesus. And we realize that Jesus is reaching out to us in this moment. He's asking each one of us, do you love me? And he's calling us to join him in his mission. So let's answer the question and let's answer the call. Jesus, we thank you for your great love for us. Thank you for the way that you invite us. That you look each one of us in the eye. We realize today you're looking each one of us in the eye and you're saying, do you love me? And you're challenging us to follow you. To give our lives on a daily basis. The things that matter to you. Thank you for the grace that you showed Peter. We know you show that same grace to us when we mess up. That you don't leave us in that mess, but you come to us and you encourage us to follow you again. We're thankful for that. As we're in this time, God, as we're worshiping you, as we're leaving from here today, God, may that be foremost on our minds. We pray these things in your name. Amen.